Light the camera. Hello, and welcome to, you want to put the screen on here?
Yeah.
Welcome to our new series called Demystifying CBAM. So what we noticed was that a bunch of our customers were wondering what the heck is the CBAM thing. They kept getting emails and frantically emailing us, which we're happy to help, but we also thought it might be helpful to give people an understanding of what's coming up in terms of regulation. There's obviously always a lot of changes in terms of the regulatory environment, especially in climate, and seemingly every week there's something new. So CBAM is the flavor of the week, but also going to be the flavor of the year. And we'll kind of explain why. And the main reason, frankly, is just the massive impact that it has. So let's wait no more. We're going to do a quick introduction, then dive straight in. So first and foremost, I think you know who I am. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Carbon Hound. Thank you so much for spending some of your afternoon with us on this delightful day. Let's feel a little bit more like fall than I would like it to. And then we've got Molly, who is our climate action specialist here at Carbon Hound. So she's working with our customers to help them navigate CBAM. She's already worked on a couple of implementations, which is great. And so she's been doing a deep dive into the legislation itself, doing all the reading that you don't want to do to really simplify and help everybody understand what CBAM is and how it's going to affect your business. So next one. So what we're going to be covering today is, what is CBAM? Who needs to report, what the reporting timelines are, because they are coming up quickly, so we'll get into that shortly, as well as some of the different ways that you can get prepared to submit for CBAM. And then, as always, we're excited to see what kind of questions that you come up with and respond to any inquiries that you might have. So this is really, for me personally, what got me really interested in trying to solve the CBAM question was because I was doing a little bit of math on it, and I found that basically, if you're just using aluminum as an example, you could be seeing a 45% tariff on the goods that you're exporting into the EU when CBAM comes into effect. And that's frankly probably a little bit conservative as well in terms of what the impact could be. So really, in my head, if I'm a business owner and I'm exporting into Europe at all, that materially impacts my ability to compete. So we thought it was really important that we bring this information to you to help you get a better understanding of whether or not you're going to be impacted and how you can help address them. So let's dive into the presentation. Over to you, Molly.
All right, thank you so much. So as Sandra said, this CBAM is going to have quite a big impact. So we wanted to just sort of give you an overview of what the CBAM is and some details about what you practically need to know to be able to support your customers and make sure that they're able to submit this reporting. So to start off, we're just going to go into what the CBAM is. So basically, the CBAM stands for the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, and it's a regulation that's coming out of the European Union. And basically, it's a way to level the playing field so that all manufacturers whose products come into the EU have a fair price on the carbon that they emitted. So the EU already has some regulations in place to have a carbon tax on the products that are manufactured within the EU. But what the CBAM does is make sure that any manufacturing that went on outside of the EU to those products before they ended up there also has that same carbon tax implemented onto it.
Finally, everyone's playing by the same rules.
Yeah. So it's a pretty interesting regulation, and it has a lot of details to it, and it's pretty complex. So we're hoping to sort of clear some of that up for you today. So some things that we just want you to know before we jump into some of the bigger details is what this applies to. So CBAM goods are basically what the European Commission has defined as the carbon-intensive materials that this regulation is going to apply to. So iron and steel, aluminum, cement, electricity, hydrogen, and fertilizers. These are all some products that have a lot of carbon emissions associated with them being manufactured. And so the EU wanted to classify these as the most important goods that they're going to focus on from the gate, and then later on there might be some more goods that they add later on. So another important thing for you to know is that it actually only, the reporting threshold is only 150 euros. So
that's nothing.
Yeah, it's such a small amount that you'll have to be reporting on your carbon emissions from your manufacturing processes. And so if your products contain any of these CBAM goods and the value of those products is worth 150 euros, then your suppliers are going to be reaching out to you, asking you to provide the climate data and greenhouse gas emissions from those manufacturing processes. So really low reporting threshold, and these are the goods that you need to know. And so we're going to dive into now sort of how you would have gotten one of these requests. So I'm not sure if some of you have already gotten a CBAM request. I'm assuming that's why most of you are here. We know our customers have been getting these requests, some back in July, but a lot of them are getting them within the past couple of weeks now. So this is just a sample to show you how your products would have been requested to have a CBAM submission. So how this works is they're importers, and they're basically the companies that are operating in the EU, and they're the ones that are responsible for completing these CBAM submissions, and any taxes that get put on the carbon emissions from the manufacturing processes are going to be the responsibility of the importer. So they're the ones that hold all of the financial burden of this regulation. However, the actual data and the CBAM reporting is all in the hands of the manufacturers, or what the CBAM calls installations. And so we're talking to all of you today because you're likely a manufacturer, and in this situation we're showing that you directly export to the EU. So you have a customer base there, and they would have reached out to you directly asking you for this CBAM data. And so if that's the case, then this is sort of the most simple scenario, but it can get a lot more complex than that, and that's why this CBAM is going to have such a big impact. So as an example of that, this could be another sort of chain of events or a supply chain that would end up with your products being in the EU. So there's an importer, they purchase directly from a manufacturer, but that manufacturer also purchases goods that go into their manufacturing processes from some other supplier. And so what the CBAM requires you to do is go all the way back down through the supply chain, so that not only will the manufacturer have to complete this CBAM report and share their climate data, but this precursor supplier is also going to have to do that. And just for some information here, precursors are basically the input materials to your manufacturing processes. So for example, if you manufacture bolts and you purchase some steel rod that goes into those bolts, the precursor would be that steel rod that you've purchased from another supplier. And then you would manufacture it into bolts, sell it to your customer in the EU, and that same chain would work backwards for how they get that CBAM climate data.
Yeah, Russian doll emissions.
Yeah, exactly. So this gets into a pretty tangled web, which we'll get into a little bit further as well. But yeah, crazy complex regulation. So it's having a massive impact. So another situation that you may come across that is also a pretty likely scenario would be that there are distributors involved. So I know that we've been keeping our eye on some online forums and trying to find some, trying to see what people are asking about the CBAM, because we want to make sure that we're answering those questions for you. And we've seen a lot of distributors that are basically getting these requests from their customers, because as the importer, you're going to go to your direct supplier to get this climate data. And the distributors are saying, hey, I don't actually manufacture this, so what am I supposed to do? How am I supposed to get the data to fill out this CBAM submission? So what you actually need to do is engage with your supply chain. So as a distributor, you would have to reach out to your manufacturer, and that manufacturer would have to reach out to their supplier, and so on and so forth, until all the emissions are accounted for before it gets to the importer.
And they'd have to do that SKU by SKU?
Yes, I believe so. So the way that the CBAM form works, which is something that we'll dive into a little bit later and in another episode of our webinars, you would be providing this, sorry, just gathering my, gathering my thoughts, but
yeah, I think so. It has to be, so my understanding at least is that based on what you're purchasing, you need to understand. So obviously if you're buying a truck, you're going to require the amount of emissions from the embodied emissions of that truck that you're exporting to the EU, right?
Yeah, so you'll be completing this form basically for every product that you manufacture. And there are ways to scale this if things are similar. But that's something that you would have to consider is all the products that end up in the EU, you will have to account for all of those.
Cool. All right.
So just to give a bit of an example here, so for example, if Ford EU is the company that's operating in Europe, and they're the large automotive manufacturer there, but they also have a subsidiary in the US that they get some supplies from, then Ford EU would be reaching out to Ford USA to ask them for the CBAM data. And so Ford USA also needs to reach out to their suppliers. And so in this example, if you're a ball bearing manufacturer, you have to reach out to the steel recycler or wherever you purchase those raw materials from. And they'll fill out a CBAM form. You'll fill out a CBAM form for the processes that took place in your facility to actually make those ball bearings. And then all of that will get forwarded on to Ford EU, who at the end of the day submits this CBAM report. All right, so we've mentioned a lot about this CBAM report, and we wanted to get into a little bit about what this would actually look like. So if any of you have gotten a request for a CBAM submission, you might recognize the words here, CBAM communication template for installations. This is basically a template that the European Commission put together to try to help the importers to get the climate data that they would need from their supply chains. And the things that are going to be included in that template are the direct emissions, indirect emissions, and the embedded emissions of the products that they're importing, as well as any carbon tax that has already been paid. And so this communication template, it is an Excel workbook that has 11 sheets within it. So I don't know, Sanders, if you've taken a look at this template at all, but it's quite a hefty document. And so we'll get into a little bit about what these direct, indirect, and embedded emissions mean. But this is a whole greenhouse gas emission calculation methodology that you'll need to be considering. And so to jump into that, basically how greenhouse gas accounting works, there's sort of, just to give a little rundown, there are a few different international frameworks that basically tell you how to get from, say, a volume of fuel that you use to carbon dioxide emissions. So some of those are the Greenhouse Gas Protocol or ISO 14064. And so these frameworks tell you how to get from your activity data to your emissions, and the EU method is another one of those. For the CBAM, they require to use this EU method. But I know here at Carbon Hound, we're a little more familiar with the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. So, and that's something that a lot of companies that are not based in the EU would be a little more familiar with. So we just wanted to sort of show you how those emissions map to each other, because If you use the greenhouse gas protocol, you don't need to worry. You don't have to redo all of your emissions calculations to be able to get this, fill out this CBAM report. You'll be able to map them to each other. So to start off, we can chat about your direct emissions. So this is basically any carbon dioxide that's emitted from heating processes that you use during your production. So for example, if you heat up a smelter, or you're basically heating up some aluminum bar so that you can mold it into a bolt, then you would need to account for the emissions from that. So whether that's you burn diesel fuel, or you import some steam, or import heat from some other source, those would be counted as your direct emissions. And in the greenhouse gas protocol, we call that your scope 1 emissions. And in here, it's also included, some parts of your scope 2 emissions would be also included in your direct emissions. Indirect emissions, that is very similar to the greenhouse gas protocol, and this is electricity that is consumed during your production processes. So basically how it works for calculating your electricity emissions is that different locations have different amounts of carbon that are emitted for generating electricity. So we're based here in Ontario, and our grid is fairly clean, so our emission factor is relatively low. But somewhere that relies a little bit more on coal or natural gas to burn electricity would have some higher emissions. And so anything that you directly use in your production process that is electric powered would count as your indirect emissions. And then embedded emissions, this is where we kind of open that whole can of worms and how you really need to engage with your supply chains, because the embedded emissions are the direct and indirect emissions from any of the raw materials before you processed it. So this is what we call scope 3 emissions in the greenhouse gas protocol. But basically this is where you would need to engage your suppliers, and how this would work back up the chain, just to bring it all back to that reporting and the sort of chain of events that we talked about earlier with the importers, is importers would reach out to their suppliers, and the suppliers would determine their direct and indirect emissions, and then reach out to their suppliers to get their direct and indirect emissions, and then all of that would get compiled together to give you the embedded emissions of whatever product the importer in the EU is purchasing. And then the EU Commission will basically take that embedded emissions value and apply that carbon tax to be able to figure out how much taxes will need to be paid for the carbon that was emitted to manufacture this product. So we chatted a little bit at the beginning about why this is going to be important right now. And so we just wanted to go into the timelines a little bit, because how the CBAM is working is there's this transitional period going on right now. And I think just the fact that this transitional period is 2 years long maybe speaks to how complicated of a regulation this is. So the transitional period goes from January 2024 to December 2025. And during this transition period, the Commission basically wants importers to get really good at figuring out the embedded emissions of their products. And so this just gives them time to engage with their supply chains, make sure that they're getting all the data correct before there are any actual taxes put on them. And these taxes do go up after the transitional period is over, which we'll get into a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I think for many people, this is quite an incredible feat. It was quite an academic exercise that they're thinking about 10 years ago. And now we're seeing it actually being implemented, and it's impacting companies from everywhere around the world. So yeah. It's actually pretty quick in terms of the implementation if you really think about it, and the level of detail. The fact that they're requiring it down to $150 worth of materials just goes to show how seriously they're taking this. So yeah, it's really cool. But we're at a transition point, aren't we?
Yeah, absolutely. So Some of you may have gotten some requests from suppliers already, and if you have, it maybe was in the past couple of weeks or so, and that's because as of July 31st, 2024, estimates are no longer allowed. So from the start of the reporting, so from the past 2 quarters in January and July, importers were allowed to use these default values, which were basically estimated values that the European Commission put together to help them quantify the emissions from their products that they're importing. But we are now entering into a new era where real activity data is going to be required. And so the next quarterly report that's going to be happening is in October. And this is the first CBAM submission that actually requires supplier activity data. And so what this means is that the supply chain engagement is going to be going on starting anytime now, and it's going to be required that you actually have this firsthand data by October. And from then on, that's going to be the norm. So there's no more using the default values, and going into the end of the transition period and then into the definitive regime when these taxes start becoming implemented, the actual activity data is going to be so important and is going to be required. And so one of the things that we wanted to touch on is, there we go, why this activity data is so important and why it's really not an option to not have your climate data be accurate and be done properly. So we've been looking into all the taxes that are going to be implemented from the definitive regime. And so right now, if the data that you're sending to your importers, or if your importers are submitting data that isn't correct, then they're looking at fines of about 10 to 50 euros per ton of carbon dioxide. So there is still small fines for having incorrect data. However, as we move into the definitive regime, the taxes go up. So as you can see in the second column here, even if the data is completely correct, as soon as the definitive regime starts, that's when the EU Commission is going to start charging per ton of carbon dioxide emitted, and that's the whole point of the CBAM, so that companies are paying that carbon tax that we talked about and paying a fair price on carbon for anything that was emitted before it made it into the EU. And so right now it's sitting at about 75 euros per ton. That's based on the European emissions trading system, which is how they determine the price of carbon, and it's basically a marketplace. So we can talk with you about that afterwards if that's something that you're interested in learning more about, or if you have any questions about it, we'd be happy to answer. But that's basically how this price on carbon is established. If the data that you're submitting is incorrect, then there is an extra $100 applied per ton of carbon dioxide. So your customers would be looking at paying about 175 euros per ton of carbon that is emitted in the production processes before they even get their hands on it. So making sure that your data is correct is so important to your customers, and if you're not able to provide this correct data, then there's a chance that your customers may be looking for people that will be able to. So it's pretty important to make sure that that you're able to satisfy the requirements.
Yeah, and I think when you're looking at that first example of the 45%, right? So that was looking at aluminum, which is a particularly dirty metal. It's about 15 tons per ton of aluminum, which is wild. And that 45% figure is actually based on the market price of aluminum, and then what it would look like to pay that CBAM tariff at the 75 euros per ton. So that's basically assuming that everything goes perfectly. That's what the cost looks like.
Yeah.
to your customers now in the EU. So, if you're, I don't know, in, let's say, aerospace, and you're sending out, aluminum parts, that could be a pretty significant change in terms of the cost that your products are going to run your customers in the EU. So, it really begs the question of, okay, now there's a real price on carbon here for our business, and how do we start to address that as a business as well? So these are some of the questions that might come out of that. But just to say, that's at $75. For the $175, and that tariff's obviously over 100% probably, right? So, and who knows what the price of per ton of CO2 is going to be in 2025, 26 as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Because the way that the emissions trading system works is that over time, they're going to reduce the number of credits that companies are allowed to have to emit. So this price of carbon is only going to continue to go up. So
we're being conservative here.
Yeah, absolutely. And so one other thing that we just wanted to touch on, because basically there's no option for your customers to not do this.
Well, there is an option, it's not a very good one.
Yeah, so if your customers were to not register as a licensed importer and they got caught importing these CBAM goods into the European Union, they would be looking at paying almost $600 per ton of carbon dioxide emitted. So this regulation is hugely important for your customers to comply with, and consequently, that makes it really important that you're able to comply and get them this data correctly.
Awesome.
Yeah. So we just wanted to touch on some different ways that you would be able to actually get this data to your customers and make sure that it's done well. So Sanders and I, we can kind of chat about each of these different options, but some things that we want you to consider before you start going about trying to complete this CBAM communication template for installations is, one thing is, how big is this customer to you? If this is one of your biggest accounts that you have and one of your biggest customers, then it's probably pretty important to you that you get this CBAM communication template done well and that all the data in there is accurate. The other thing is considering if you've already done any climate reporting. If you have, it might be less of a lift on your team to be able to fill out this report. But if you're starting from square one, then it might be worth it to look into getting some help, just because this is quite a complex document to tackle. And as we said, the timelines are coming up. You're going to be needing to submit this report in October.
Yeah, which means that you probably need to get talking to either doing it yourself internally pretty quickly, because basically this is kind of like a product carbon footprint light.
Yeah.
Right? Where you're really trying to understand and dig into what are the components of the product that I'm putting into the EU, and what are the materials of those products that I'm putting into the EU, that I'm exporting into the EU. And then from there, that tells you what those CBAM materials are and how much you're going to have to disclose. But I would also say, especially for North American companies who aren't used to the terminology that's being used in some of this documentation, there's a little bit of a translation that needs to happen in order to ensure that you're doing it right. And I do think, luckily speaking, the fines are much more lax over the next year or so, but at the same time, there are still fines if you don't do it correctly. So it's about trying to get it right and make sure that you've got the credibility behind that, so you're not putting your customer in a position where they're going to see unexpected costs for doing business with you. And so, yeah, I think when you look at doing it yourself, I remember trying to do this stuff myself, and there's a lot of jargon you have to figure out. In terms of hiring a consultant, I think that's, if you can find somebody who's got some experience in it, I think it can be super valuable. Obviously, this is quite new for everyone because it's a brand new regulation as well. But they'll definitely be able to help you and guide you with a little bit more expertise, which would be incredibly helpful.
Yeah, absolutely.
Obviously, there's a cost with that.
And you'll be paying a premium to have this done by October if they're going to be slammed with a bunch of people all hoping to do the same thing.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, but there's nothing wrong with hiring a consultant. Again, just finding the right one. Make sure you look for ones that have experience in the space, who are dealing with European regulations, who've done it before. And then obviously option 3 is leveraging software, right? So I think one of the really interesting components of this regulation is that it's not just a one and done. So any changes to your product, they're going to have to then redo that reporting. And frankly, you need to submit this quarterly, right? So 4 times a year, you're going to have to send this data in. So it could be easier to have a piece of software to help you with that, given how frequent that reporting is. So it's a little bit different from a lot of the other reporting requirements in that typically those are annual. And so the frequency, you don't necessarily want to be paying for a fresh report every quarter. Software can definitely be helpful in terms of trying to drive those compliance costs down.
Yeah, absolutely. And so once the definitive regime takes over, it will switch to annual reporting. But in the meantime, you're looking at, what would that be? I guess 5 reports between now and then that you're going to have to submit. So make sure that you take into account the repeatability of this and how many times you're going to want to either do this yourself, or if you do look into having a software, then seeing if that's something that can just automate this reporting for you, so that you basically set it up once and it's ready to go for the next 5 reports.
Cool.
All right. So we just wanted to, as I mentioned, we've been sort of looking into some of the different forums online and paying attention to what people are saying about this. So we're going to have a bit of a question and answer period after this, but we just wanted to get the ball rolling with some of the FAQs that we've been seeing about the CBAM. So one of the things that we've been seeing a lot is basically a question about why can't the EU just put a carbon tax onto everything that that is being imported and just call it a day? Wouldn't that be so much simpler? So Sanders, I'm not sure if you wanted to speak to that, or I'd be happy to.
Well, the logic from the perspective of the EU is that, frankly, they wanted, it's the 80-20 rule a little bit, right? So how do we get the majority of the emissions that we're worried about, leakage? So leakage is where you see emissions just being pushed to a country, let's say outside the EU. So you're not actually solving the emissions problem, you're just moving it. So they're trying to avoid leakage because obviously they want to keep their manufacturing in-house, and they also want to address the industries that are the most polluting. So as a result, they've identified these particular materials as being the worst offenders based on the current technology. And I think the goal here is, how do we address material emissions that we're importing whilst keeping the requirements from reporting burden perspective as low as possible for all businesses. Because I think if you did this for all products, it would be an even larger challenge, right? So I think they're basically saying, let's start with these CBAM products. They could always add more later. There's nothing stopping them from doing that. Yeah. But hey, let's get this going with the most important materials, and then make sure everything's working in terms of how we administer it, in terms of watching those emissions go down, in terms of creating incentives for lower carbon exports into the EU. And then they can always double down on that later if they feel like they want to. Yeah,
absolutely. And I think, the potential for this regulation to expand into other emissions intensive goods is definitely there. And the other thing is that if the EU were just to put a carbon tax onto even just the CBAM goods that they're already talking about, and didn't do any of this reporting, then there's the potential that these importers would be paying double for carbon tax, because say you're based somewhere that already has a carbon tax implemented, that's taken into account when they do this CBAM reporting. So the importers are only paying the difference. So if you're already paying a carbon tax on your goods, then that'll be disclosed in your CBAM submission, and the importers won't be paying double, because basically the EU just wants to make sure that the carbon is being accounted for somewhere.
Yeah, but it's a pretty limited like jurisdictions that, to my understanding, that actually meet the criteria that the EU is expecting, because the EU has the most stringent, environmental reporting probably in the world.
Yeah.
And so if they want everyone to be to their standard, then you can understand that would be a pretty small pool.
Yeah.
So the chances are, especially in North America, you're going to be paying more.
Yeah, absolutely. Something else that we've been sort of seeing come up quite a bit is these default values, and also just the supplier engagement. And so if I can't get this data from my suppliers, I've reached out, they're not replying, what am I supposed to do? Am I going to lose a customer over this? Can I just use the default values that the Commission has published? And sort of how do I go about that? So for this, the EU has basically decided that importers need to have activity data for 80% of the emissions that they're bringing into the EU. And so if they're not able to directly engage with suppliers, there is still a little bit of wiggle room to be able to use those default values. But the whole point of the CBAM is that there is good supplier engagement and good communication between suppliers and customers. And so your importers are the ones at the end of the day that need to have this 80% coverage. So it's not really.
So basically no.
Yeah, basically no. You need to do everything that you can to engage with your suppliers, get this real activity data, and then basically getting as much data as possible. And the importers are the ones that have that sort of threshold where if they're not able to engage with some supplier, then that's their discretion to use.
I do find it quite funny though that they're also using the 80-20 rule in
this
circumstance.
Yeah.
So at least there's some thought around that, which is great. Cool. I think the fact is that if you're, I think the 80% rule is also a buffer, because if you're onboarding new suppliers and that sort of thing, then it might be difficult to keep that at 100% from a practical perspective. Mm-hmm. So if I'm supplying somebody in the EU, like the expectation is that you will be providing this information. So just because it's 80-20 doesn't mean that you're not going to be impacted. Like, you should expect to be impacted, because I'm assuming many companies won't just use one company in Europe that they're selling to, they're probably selling to most. And so the materiality of that will be important to understand in terms of, okay, maybe I'm sneaking into that 20% for this company, but you definitely won't for this other one.
Yeah, absolutely.
And as I said, I think the goal is for most companies to get that buffer, so if they are onboarding new suppliers, that they are still compliant.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay. Who in my company will likely get these CBAM requests, Molly?
So this is something that you'll definitely want to keep an eye on. You'll want to know who in your company needs to look out in their inbox for this CBAM communications template for installations. So what we've been seeing mostly is that it's typically the account managers or salespeople that are actually getting these requests. However, these probably aren't the people that are actually putting together your CBAM report. So making sure that you have sort of that cross-functional communication within your teams is going to be super important for this, so that if one of your account executives does get a CBAM request, then your EHS department or your sustainability department knows about it and is ready to get going on completing this. And also your procurement department, if you need to reach out to your suppliers as well. So the CBAM is sort of promoting this collaboration between suppliers and customers, but also I think it's really going to be promoting a lot more cross-functional work within companies as well.
Yeah, I think it's a really great point, because when we think about CBAM, it's not, I think it's really easy just to think about, okay, how do we comply to this? Yeah. But then, as an executive, what are the next questions that you're asking, right? So, how do we need to think about how we're procuring raw materials for our goods and services, right? So maybe we do need to implement new practices, because fundamentally, if there's now a price on the carbon of the goods that we're sending, okay, how do we reduce the amount of metal in our products? How do we reduce the amount of aluminum? How do we think about alternative materials and manufacturing processes to limit the impact of these regulations on our importing customers, right? So I think it's quite actually a strategic conversation, really, at the end of the day. I think if people who are doing this right are thinking about the long-term impacts on their business and the competitiveness in these markets. And I think that's really what's going to shift, is you're going to notice that if you've got a product that's even a little bit of a commodity, but there's other alternatives that might be in the EU already, I think you've got to be concerned about those contracts. And you want to make sure you're getting ahead of it during this transition period. So for me, it's not really just a transition period as it relates to the reporting aspect. It's actually a transition period as it relates to how do we decarbonize our business so that when the transition period is over, that our pricing is still competitive and that we can keep all of our clients. Because at the end of the day, that's what really matters. And maybe who of our competitors might be overexposed based on the knowledge I have of their operations. Maybe we've got somebody who just came over from there. And are there opportunities for us to increase market share in the EU as a result? So these are all the questions that I like to talk about, because I think we talk a lot about climate regulation as being a pain to meet, but I think it's also creating a huge amount of opportunity for companies who are getting ahead of it and thinking about it in a strategic way. And that really rewards businesses for taking climate action around the world, which is super cool. And that's really, I think, the point that the EU is trying to put in is, hey, we've committed to these goals as a global community, and so we're just holding you to account on them.
Yeah,
Okay.
absolutely.
Cool. Any other questions? So I think, unless we've got any other questions, I think we got a question here around, does my CBAM submission need to be verified or audited by a third party?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and something that you definitely need to consider, especially as we talked about when you're choosing whether to do it yourself, hire a consultant, or leverage software, is considering whether or not you need to verify your emissions as well. So basically, just brief overview, what verification is basically a third party would be looking at all of your emissions and looking at your CBAM report, and just making sure that everything is done correctly and with alignment with all the regulations. And so from the CBAM regulations, verification is not required quite yet. So potentially starting in 2026, the rules around what's actually going to happen are still evolving. And in general, the CBAM regulation will continue to evolve over the next 2 years. So in 2026, this verification will be required, but it's sort of unclear on who is going to be required to verify, whether it will be the importers that are actually based in the EU and whether they're going to need a verification there, or whether or not it's going to be the actual suppliers and manufacturers themselves that are going to need to get this information verified.
Cool. I think we've got another question here around, are there EU climate regulations that will be in other EU climate regulations impacting North American manufacturers? So yes, long story short. So I think we recently did an analysis, and what we found was that there's about 60,000 of the world's largest businesses, from China to the EU to Australia to eventually Canada to California. They're all being regulated not just on their emissions of their operations, but more importantly, their supply chain. So as a result, there will be requests going into the supply chain. So if you're a member of a supply chain of basically a company that's within the top 60,000 largest companies in the world, chances are pretty good that you're going to get some sort of reporting requirement from them. So, and also one to consider is there's been a proliferation of greenwashing regulations across North America, including in California, Canada, C59, which was I think a couple months ago, and then we've got in the UK, they've also got their own greenwashing rules there, as well as in the EU, including areas where terms like carbon neutral are actually banned. So basically, if you're selling into Europe and you've got any of these environmental claims on your website, then you do need to be careful of those as well. So there's a lot of different ways that, frankly, for the most part, EU regulation is really influencing the world in terms of how they sell. But if you look at the North American context, the same thing for California and Canada, right? Which, you add those two up, those are pretty significant customer bases for many of, at least our customers. And so basically, if there's anything on your site that needs to be, that you're making any claims around, they're just trying to force companies to actually substantiate their claims so that you can't basically make false claims, which makes sense because that's the way advertising should work. But I think we're really excited about it because it allows the companies who are doing the right thing, who are taking the right steps and doing it with credibility, to be able to showcase that. And that, combined with the EU regulations, creates a little bit of a carrot and a stick for businesses to create a really strong business case for climate action.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's what this entire regulation is. This regulation and any other regulations that are coming out are all just going to be fuel for really making climate action part of your business and making it profitable to do better for the environment and for the climate.
Yeah, I forgot to say, I think we crunched some numbers, we did some estimates, and based on the model we created, we expect about 4 million companies to be impacted by these regulations. So the chances are pretty good that you're going to be impacted by it. So last question here, unless we've got any others from the group, is are you going to show us how to actually do this thing? How are we going to complete the communication template?
Yeah, that is a fantastic question. So I'm really glad that you asked, because our next
may have been a planted question.
Yeah, our next webinar is actually going to be focused on doing this. So we're going to have another one of our climate action specialists here that has been doing these CBAM submissions and supporting our customers in getting this done. She's going to walk you through step-by-step how to fill out the CBAM communication template for installations, just to give you that guidance on how to do this if you are trying to do it yourself. So the details on that we will be sharing with all of you as we put them together. And so keep an eye on your inbox for that. And yeah, we'll walk you through how to do this so that you can be empowered to support your customers and make sure that you've got the right data where it needs to be.
Cool. Thank you so much, Molly. Appreciate that. And so that's the end of the first Demystifying CBAM webinar.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for that. Really informative. I hope that you guys found it as useful as I did. And looking forward for part 2.
Yeah, thank you all so much for attending, and